Alright, so voice comms in ZvZ. Everyone knows, get everyone in Discord, have everyone in a single channel, shot caller says everything, everyone else shut the hell up. But if you've been playing the game and doing ZvZs, you'll notice that the shot caller is often not enough. Especially if you've been shot calling, there's just such a lack of information and you can't micromanage everyone. So the solution slash idea that I've been working on is to get the different subgroups within your Zerg to manage each other or at least coordinate with each other directly. You can do this by having a secondary voice comms channel for these different groups so that the players can talk to each other. Whether it's TeamSpeak or Vent or your guild uses mobile's like sub-channel talking thing, whatever. This certainly isn't a new idea at this point, and I'm certainly not the only one trying to get this system working, but unless things have changed recently, no one's really doing it successfully. And I want to push for this to be the kind of standard operating procedure for Zergs. So the most common example of this is for Locust. When you don't have your Locust players communicating, you're really relying on essentially some of your players to be good and some of them to be bad. For example, the enemy engages and catches a group. Every good Locust player would know to drop on that clump. However, if all of your Locust players drop on that clump, you're wasting a ton of resources, potentially fight-altering resources. Or, you're trying to push a choke, you need a Locust on the choke to make sure you can get through it, but you also need a Locust on the choke when you're retreating back through it. And to be honest, you're probably going to need 3 Locusts chained back to back in order to last long enough, and the likelihood of that happening without communication is very small. So the primary goal, as I just mentioned, is to reduce waste. This applies to other roles as well, and not just Locusts. So, how many Fallen resets does it actually take to heal someone? Like 2, maybe 3 tops. If you have 50 people, that's 10 healers, and if shit goes down, like we've all seen, all of a sudden all the healers panic drop. 7 of those are wasted. Second big thing is that it reduces the load on the shot caller. If you have a Locust squad that you can trust, or a healer squad for that matter, you no longer have to worry about calling for drops. You shouldn't have to worry about calling for heals because the healers will have that sorted out, and if there's no drop, the assumption would be that everything is on CD. Of course, it'll take some time to work out the kinks and build the trust, but it's one less thing for the shot caller to eventually worry about. A more subtle point is that it increases the personal responsibility of the players. Normally, if the shot caller sees that something goes wrong, he goes, "Oh, healers, you fucked up." But blaming a group is a really ineffective way for actually introducing change. You have to get to the individual level. When your healers, for example, coordinate who's going to drop and engage, it is now those players' responsibility for playing correctly. This comes with all the benefits and downsides of responsibility. If you play well, it'll be very obvious in a healer VOD review, oh, I'll drop first, and then you drop first and save everyone. Obviously, it was you. But if you mess up, that's also apparent. And problem players will start to reveal themselves, out of the group, because it'll be consistently, you'll see that they're the person messing up. Whatever you do with that is up to you, but I also find that personal responsibility combats that feeling of being just a slave Zerg member. I don't really see that joke or meme as much anymore, but it used to be a big thing of, you're just a slave to Money Guild or whatever. So having that personal responsibility really kind of incorporates you into the team structure of the Zerg. Which brings me to my final positive, which is building camaraderie. So it's usually pretty awkward at first, but eventually, if consistent, even introverted people will eventually become comfortable and start to just make conversation during downtime and whatnot. So really, you're giving this space to allow a team to form, which comes with all the benefits of that. People are more likely to attend, people are more likely to be more loyal, assuming, of course, that the players are consistent enough to really form those bonds. Okay, maybe I should have put this at the beginning since I've already talked about a few of them, but the who should be in these subgroup comms. Big two that we talked about are the Locusts and Healers for reasons already discussed. Another common one is beam duos, so the arcane empowering beam and their target. So your cults and your great arcane stabs, and whoever they're beaming would be in a channel, so it's a little easier for them to kind of follow each other around and know when the person's actually going to engage and drop and when they should get beamed and whatnot. Less common, but I think still valuable, would be the tanks, which I will kind of detail what I think that should be in a minute. Lastly, though not all-encompassing, is if you had a scouting / bloodletter group. So essentially that'd be a group that's kind of coordinating scouting information among each other. They're the people that go out early, scout, talks amongst each other, and then kind of report back, preferably to a single player who then reports back the important information, rather than the shot caller getting flooded with useless information. And then when the fight breaks out, they would rejoin the fight and kind of essentially coordinate being bloodletters together. So, oh, this person, like, here's a healer, we can pick out this guy and kill him. Here's a really high IP bomber, pick out that guy and kill him. Or, oh, there's a group of low health people over here, let's assassinate these guys. Things like that. Okay, we've got the what and why out of the way, and now we can talk about the hows. So how it should sound, how to make it useful, more or less. I stated earlier that the primary function of the subgroup comms is to reduce waste. We do that by declaring the order of drops, which you can do in a couple of ways. Personally, as a Locust player, I prefer that players call out their own order. So for example, you're mounted, you're running up to a territory, everyone dismounts, and then you go, hey, I'll get first as we push the choke. Then someone else will be like, okay, I'll follow that. And then someone else goes, okay, I'll save mine for when we're retreating out of the choke. Things like that. This makes it so that no one person has to divert their attention away from the fight in order to manage other people. It does require everyone to be a pretty active participant in the comms, which can be difficult to get people out of their shell, but having someone else dictate it, I find can be pretty messy. Each player knows what their cooldown is and where they're positioned, whether or not they even can drop on something. Someone else trying to shot call doesn't have that information, and it takes way too long to get that information to a caller and still remain flexible. A caller will likely resort to a standard procedure to make it easier for themselves, while the players can more easily adapt on the fly, which we'll talk about when we're talking about how the comm should work. Also keep in mind that it's a little more work for the healers than, like, say, the Locust, because usually there's more of them, you have more people in comms. You also probably need at least 2 people for each drop, depending on the situation. But you can also come up with your own way of doing things. Maybe having a shot caller is better for you guys. You guys have to figure that out for yourself. In order to maintain the order of the drops, everyone needs to be calling out when and preferably where they're dropping. So this lets other players know when it is their turn. You should also call out when your cooldown comes back up so that the order of drops can reset. So, like, essentially, if you drop first and then someone drops second, and then there's kind of a lull and the third person is waiting to drop, if the first person comes back off of cooldown, you can just take back over the order, and the third person can continue to wait. Depending on how you do it. So it's totally possible for a player kind of at the end of the rotation or acting like a reserve just never needs to drop, and that's okay. They can start using their resources for other things, like saving it for an emergency clap or trying to recover from a clap if they're a healer, that kind of thing. The follow-up to our order of drops is covering for each other. So what I mean is, say you dismount, someone calls that they're going to drop first, but then the situation changes. Say like a blob zones out from behind you, and all of a sudden the Zerg turns around, and now that first person's no longer in position to drop. It's their responsibility to call that out, and for your team, whether it's locusts or healers, to readjust the order of drops. So maybe that might be the second person takes over the first drop, or the reserve player has to cover the first drop, whatever it is. You guys need to coordinate that you can't make her drop, and someone else needs to say that they can cover it. And then once the first person, so like, say the second player takes over, and then the reserve player is getting ready to drop as a follow-up, but then the first player says that they're back in position, that means the reserve player can continue to fill that reserve spot and hold on to theirs for when it's needed. Another scenario is if one of the players gets CC'd. So say you're a healer that's supposed to kind of drop during the enemy engage, but instead you're caught up in the engage. You can call for help and try and get someone to cover for you. This means that the team needs to make sure they know who is up next so that too many resources aren't committed to, recovering from someone getting interrupted. I did say I would talk about tanks. For tank comms, this is a little more hypothetical and less from experience since I don't play tank and actually no one uses tank comms, but I think they could really use it. The obvious thing is following the order of drops that I stated earlier. There's really no sense in all of the tanks immediately dropping their CC at once. Good tanks will know that they need to kind of like space out their CC, but no matter how good you are, you can't stop someone from dropping at the same time as you without being able to communicate who's going to drop when. Or even, an even worse situation is two people need to drop at the same time, but they're both trying to space it out and wait for the other person to drop, and then neither of them drops and someone gets away, or something stupid like that that's completely unnecessary. You can also flexibly coordinate who's going to act as like a counter-engage tank, so someone that's going to drop when the enemy engages and try and interrupt that. And when I say flexible, I mean that it's like you could dictate it beforehand, but when you run into situations where, like, say your main engaged tanks die and the anti-engaged tanks don't know because they're not in comms, no one can tell them, and all of a sudden you don't have any tanks with your main engage. Obviously you would want your anti-engaged tanks to take over, but maybe they don't know that they need to take over. Another situation would be, what if like one of your main tanks sees a bomb squad coming in? He might drop his E on that bomb squad in order to stop it, and now you need someone to take over his role. You can't really communicate that without having them in comms together. The current solution is to just blindly have everyone engage at the same time, wasting a bunch of CCs. Like probably half the tanks, their CC isn't even needed because they're just overlapping a stun and DRing the person faster. Things like that. I say that too much. But yeah, ZvZs are messy and complicated, and so in my opinion, the way around that is to kind of get smaller subgroups and allow them to coordinate and work together. So to quickly summarize before I end the video, 1, you should have a secondary comm set up for the subgroups within your Zerg to talk amongst themselves. 2, those subgroups need to determine an order of drops amongst themselves and adapt it even between every engage if they need to. 3, this really wasn't one of my points, but the game is a sandbox and you can implement this kind of system however you want. Even calling it a system is probably like giving it too much credit. But you can also just not and keep, wondering why you're bad and relying on hand-holding just to win. So getting people comfortable with talking can be pretty difficult, but hopefully the examples I laid out about kind of what the comms should be like helps.